Russia has won the war in Ukraine, but is in no hurry to end it, as much of its army remains in reserve. It enjoys the friction in NATO, whose members suffer from the resulting high energy costs and mass Ukrainian immigration. Russia prefers to slowly destroy Ukraine's army in the open farmland of the Donbas, rather than chase it into major cities where fighting would prove horrible. At some point, Ukraine's army will collapse, and the Russians will roll forth and take all of Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin signed 4 peace agreements to end this conflict. Each time, Ukraine never complied after pressure from NATO leaders to fight on. Russia will not agree to yet another ceasefire so NATO can rebuild Ukraine's army and restart the war. NATO leaders assume that a Russian victory only means that Ukraine will be forced to cede Crimea and its 4 eastern provinces that Russia annexed in 2022. Ukraine can then rebuild its economy and army and join the European Union economic bloc known as the EU and NATO. They don't grasp this is not possible because Russia will make Ukraine a vassal state, what Putin calls demilitarized.
There will be peace when we achieve our goals. Now, let's get back to these goals. They don't change. Let me remind you of what we talked about the denazification of Ukraine, about demilitarization, about its neutral status. We will agree on demilitarization and agree on certain parameters. During the negotiations in Istanbul, we agreed on them, but then they simply threw these agreements into the oven. There are other possibilities, either to reach an agreement or to resolve it by force.
A myth persists that Russia will never invade Western Ukraine because it's the home of Ukrainian nationalists who would cause them trouble. But this is exactly why Russia will invade this region, to denazify it. Russia will not allow Western Ukraine to remain independent, to become a NATO-armed vassal state and a source of endless trouble. Russia has already formed volunteer units with ethnic Ukrainians from the Donbas and POWs, who will become the new Ukrainian army to keep order. Russia will force Ukraine to rejoin the Russian-dominated military alliance called the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Russian troops will train and advise Ukrainian border troops, meaning they will prevent CIA arms smuggling to Nazi terror groups. Russian troops will occupy NATO's huge training base near Lviv in western Ukraine to ensure peace. Russia became much stronger during this war by expanding trade with Asia and enlarging its army, while its 4 newly annexed provinces are rich in natural gas and coal. This makes Europe even more dependent on Russian energy. Russia provided Europe with oil and natural gas during its war in Ukraine, even after EU sanctions were imposed. Russia never broke contract agreements and cut off oil and gas to Europe, except to some European nations who refused to pay, citing EU sanctions. Despite American and EU sanctions against Russia, exceptions were allowed because several EU nations are dependent on Russian oil and gas supplies. A Russian victory in Ukraine means that it will also indirectly control Ukraine's remaining oil and natural gas production and all pipelines from the east into Europe. Will Russia continue to provide EU nations with oil and gas at much lower prices than they pay for American oil and gas, especially to nations who maintain EU economic sanctions against Russia? The United States insists that Russian energy supplies to Europe can be replaced by importing more oil and natural gas from the United States and the Middle East. Delivering this by ship is far more expensive than direct pipelines from Russia. Natural gas is 4 times more expensive to import by ship, since it must be super chilled to condense it into liquefied natural gas that is delivered by expensive refrigerated tankers. This form of delivery is dangerous, as concentrated natural gas is explosive and moving it by ship hazardous. Supplies from the Middle East can be disrupted by political turmoil there, while the United States has limited reserves to export. Exporting more natural gas caused prices to soar in the United States. So in January 2024, American President Joe Biden blocked plans for new ship terminals to increase exports. In contrast, pipelines are very secure, and Russia has massive reserves. Most of eastern Russia hasn't even been explored for oil and gas reserves that can provide Europe with cheap energy for another century. In 2022, Russia turned eastward to quickly expand trade with China and India. It sought new members for its economic alliance called the Eurasian Economic Union, which encourages the free movement of goods and services, provides common policies in transport, industry, agriculture, energy, foreign trade, investment, customs, technical regulation, and antitrust regulation. This union recently signed free trade agreements with Egypt, Iran, India, and Singapore, and other nations are interested. As Russian troops arrive on Ukraine's western border, the opportunity for several European nations to embrace the prosperous East will arise. Europeans know the United States caused the conflict in Ukraine, profits from banning Russian oil and gas, and remain uneasy about the mysterious destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. The Americans promoted a mindless NATO expansion strategy that caused a disastrous war in Ukraine and weakened NATO nations, who were pressured to donate billions of dollars and much of their military equipment to Ukraine, even though it isn't a member of this defensive alliance. An American refusal to make peace after Russia conquers Ukraine to reestablish trade will further agitate some NATO members, who may leave the EU and possibly NATO to join the winning side for a huge discount in Russian energy imports. NATO's attempt to add Ukraine was foolish and resulted in a proxy war with Russia that it lost. This was no surprise to clear-thinking people like Glenn Greenwald.
There was no way Ukraine was going to beat Russia without the deployment of NATO troops into that war, which could never have happened because that would have been World War III with a nuclear in power. And those of us who said it at the time and who said this war is going to produce no good, it's not defending Ukrainians, it's destroying Ukraine and sacrificing Ukrainians at the altar of the real American goal, which is to weaken Russia, we're called Russian agents, we're called Putin apologists, and we lost that debate because the media always succeeds in getting majorities of Americans on the side of whatever new shiny war they present. Yeah, forget about Iraq, forget about Libya, forget about Syria, forget about Vietnam. All the times we lied to you, all the times we told you things were going to happen that didn't happen. Forget about all that. We have a new war. This one's the real deal. This time we're really on the good side. This one's different. And every time it turns out not to be.